It's a nice day out. Maybe they're out there, not in here.
Yeah.
So just to be sure I'm on the right page, we did the second muscle stuff last week, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're starting the nervous system today. And the nervous system is covered over 5 different chapters. And so we're going to start with the first of those chapters, which is about nervous tissue, essentially. And it's actually going to be the topic for this week and next week. This week, I'm going to concentrate on the anatomy side of things, which is mostly about what makes up nervous tissue, the cells that we find there, that sort of thing. And then next week, we're going to concentrate on how electrical activity takes place in nervous tissue, which will correspond to understanding that same basic stuff about muscle tissue, which we, of course, have already finished covering, but it'll apply there too. So this is this week's folder, obviously, and in this we see the nervous tissue parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. You wouldn't yet because you haven't done those, but once you finish part 1, you'll see part 2, et cetera, et cetera. Next week's folder, there's not a part 1, 2, 3, 4 set of assignments because it's still the same chapter. Instead, this is where the laboratory material is that goes with this. And actually, we'll start the laboratory stuff this week, looking at the cells on micrographs. But the quiz here is called Neuroanatomy Lab Quiz, and it's more than just what we're going to be doing this week. We'll continue that next week. And actually, there's a chance, depending on what happens next week, that we won't get to finish the lab material, and I might push that off to the following week. But that's the plan. So I put the lab material in the week 11 folder, which is next week, and I put the chapter assignments here. The due date for the chapter assignments, part 1, 2, 3, 4 assignments, is April 26, which is not next week. Since we're doing this chapter over the course of 2 weeks, its assignments are due after the next week's material. You just put them in this week's folder so you can get started on them. I wouldn't suggest that you submit the part 4 material until after we finish next week, but you can do the part 1, 2, and 3 material all you want, because if there's stuff that we haven't covered this week that's in next week, you'll get that. You get a chance to retake those assignments then, but all of those are due on the 26th. Let me just take a second to talk a little bit about what's going on for the rest of the course. Let's see, where do I want to go here? In the weekly material here. Okay. So here's this week and next week I just talked about. They are sort of one chapter worth of material separated over 2 weeks. And then next week we're going to, not the next week, after that week. And I should point out, the dates here are wrong after snow days and all that sort of thing. I updated the schedule and the syllabus, but I didn't go in and update these dates here. So ignore these dates, they're wrong. But anyway, so this week and next week we're dealing with the first chapter on the nervous system, the nervous tissue chapter. And then in week 12, we'll be dealing with actually a couple of chapters. There's a chapter that's called Anatomy of the Nervous System and a chapter called the Somatic Nervous System. And they kind of go together as far as what we're doing in class at this point. And there's only one set of chapter assignments. So what's called nervous system part 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are out of order here. There we go. 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is, again, this is week 12, a couple weeks from now. But these 4 assignments are actually sort of over a couple of chapters worth of material. And when we get there, I'll talk a little bit more about how that stuff breaks down. And then week 13, which is called neurological correlates. If you go in here, you'll see that there are no part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. There used to be a learning pod assignment in here, but since we're not doing learning pods anymore, I took that out. This is technically about another chapter in the book. I don't have a set of assignments to go with that. I probably will someday in the future, but at this point, I don't have another set of assignments for this chapter. So there's nothing more in that. Which is to say, really all you have left as far as chapter assignments are concerned for the rest of the semester is this week and next week. You have one set of part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. And then week 12, you have another set, part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. There's not going to be assignments in the week 13 stuff. I'll show you the chapter structure for this unit in a second when we go to the book. And then you have, in this folder here that says Lab Practical 2 and Cumulative Final, you have material about the second practical, which is what we'll be doing on the day of the final exam, which is May 13th at 1:35. That probably is Wednesday of exam week. The way that exam weeks works is that classes that meet on Monday, Wednesday, and or Friday have their final exam periods corresponding to class time, pretty much, on Monday or Wednesday of final exam week. So 8 o'clock classes are on Monday, 9:05 classes are on Wednesday, 10:10 classes are on Monday. What's next? 11:15 classes are on Wednesday. There's something wrong there. I might have the Monday and Wednesday set up wrong, but whatever it works out to be, the 1:35 classes are on Wednesday. So that doesn't work great for you guys because you're technically in a Monday class, but just be aware that for this class, the final exam meeting will be on Wednesday. One would assume you don't have a class at this time on Wednesday because there aren't that many things that meet once a week. You might have a lab, but that doesn't matter. This is about lecture. Labs do not have a final exam schedule themselves. It's all based on what the lecture is. So it shouldn't be a problem. The cumulative final is an online assignment. We're not doing that the day of the final. It's not a physical test you'll be taking, it's just online. But the 2 assignments that are in here, the practical, online portion of the practical, and the cumulative final, they're both set to be due, I believe at 1:35 on May 13th. Yes, in fact, that's true. So they are set to be done for when you come in that day for the final exam. That is your last chance to do anything on Blackboard. When you come in to do the in-class practical test that day, I'll be shutting down access to Blackboard for the class. So you need to have finished everything by then. Okay. I have in the past made things due all the way out to the end of final exams week. And I found that doesn't really help too much. The people that put things off until the last minute are not going to do very well. People that do well have it, go ahead and get things done on time.
Wait, so the current final do when you shutting in Blackboard again?
Sorry?
What are you shutting down Blackboard?
So when you come in at 1:35 on May 13th, you need to have everything done because when you're taking the test that day, I'll be shutting off access to Blackboard. So you have to have everything done by then.
Until that time.
Yeah. You'll be able to work on stuff up till then. Now, you can do anything up to that point. So if there's material that you haven't completed yet, you basically have until 1:35 on the 13th to get all that done. If you didn't do, the chapter 1 assignments back then, you can still get them done. The only things that were time sensitive were learning pods, and all of those should be done now. So any other assignments that you haven't completed, you can get those done. Let me take a second to talk about the cumulative final now, because sort of the way it works and the approach to studying, you should have some time, you should put some time into it. So I want to make sure you understand now, and you'll have a month to work on it, of course. It's 50 multiple choice questions, and it's drawing from the same questions that you've had all semester, which means the part 1 and 2 assignments for each chapter. So what I did to build that test, I just went in there and I said, use the pool of questions from chapter 1, part 1, and chapter 1, part 1, and chapter 1, part 2. Use those and pull 5 questions out of that for the first 5 questions of the test. And then I said for chapter 2, part 1, and chapter 2, part 2, use 5 questions out of all of that for the next 5 questions of the test. A pool for one of those assignments might be 20 or 30 questions. It ranges depending on how many I put in there to begin with. And the test will just be pulling from that. You can prepare for the cumulative final by going back and looking at all of the questions that you've answered. And all of those questions are available for the assignment to build the test with. If you took, say, part 1 of chapter 1 in one attempt, and you got 9 questions right on that, so you could go on to part 2, you might not have gone to do any more work on that part 1 assignment because you didn't need to go to part 2. But that means that you only saw 10 of the questions from that pool. If you want to see all of the questions from that pool, what you need to do is to go back in there and do that assignment a few more times. I don't know exactly how many. There's sort of a random aspect to it, but probably after 6 or so attempts, you should be able to see all of the questions in the pool. If you open up a new attempt and all of the questions there are questions that you've already seen, then you can probably guess that you've seen all the questions there. It's unlikely that you'll open up an attempt and get exactly the same questions you've gotten before. So you should be able to see all of them over, like I said, about 6 attempts or so. If you got 9 out of 10 on that one and only attempt, and you do it again, you have a chance to get it up to 10 points. So you can go ahead and try that. Just be sure that you do the assignment, because if you leave it blank, then that's 0 points. If you just open it up to look at the questions there without answering them, then you won't get any credit for that assignment. Whatever your last attempt is, that's the one that goes into the grade book. So if you took it once and you got a 9, you say, well, I'm going to go in there and look at more questions, and you open it up and you don't do any of them, you just look at the questions, then you're going to get a 0 for that assignment. Be sure that you complete the assignment so that your last attempt is the best you can get. And as you're doing that, I'd strongly suggest that you really try to make sure you get all 10 of them correct. It's just going to help your test, your grade in the end. So over the next month, you can spend some time going back and looking at the assignments you've already done. If you open up a new attempt and there are new questions there, then obviously you haven't seen the whole pool and you can look at those. Now, you might have noticed this as you've been doing these assignments, that even if you get the same question, the answer choices aren't necessarily in the same order. I haven't randomized the answer choices. So when you're looking at it, don't just say, oh, this question, the answer is B. This is probably not going to be B the next time. Just be sure that you understand what the answer to a particular question is, and you can take it again. I used to give this as a written in-class test the day of the final, which was about 2 hours long. Students would take the in-class portion of the practical and this test. Both of them are 50 multiple choice question tests. They can probably be done in about an hour on paper, and so that'd be enough time for people to take those 2 tests. What would more often happen is that people would take an hour and a half or so on the practical and then only have about a half hour to take the final. So I switched to doing it online so there wasn't that competition for time. And you'll probably still be able to do it within about an hour or so, but it does have a timer on it, just like all the other timed multiple choice question tests. It's going to be about 2 minutes per question. So a 10 question quiz, you get 20 minutes on. For this one, 50 questions, we get 100 minutes, which is an hour and 40 minutes. I doubt anybody will need that much time, but there is a time limit on there. You actually get 3 attempts at that test, not unlimited, just 3. Those 3 attempts are not likely to be at all the same. There's probably 250, 300 questions that are all of the pools combined for that. So the 50 questions that you get on any attempt are not likely to be repeated for multiple attempts. You might get a couple of questions here and there the same, but for the most part, it'll probably give you a whole new test each time you take it. For this one, the best of the 3 grades is the one that goes in the grade book. If you take it once, you get 35 out of 50. Like, oh, I can do better than that. Take it again, you get 42 out of 50. Say, well, I can still do better than that. Take it again, you get 38 out of 50. The 42 goes in.
Wait, so it's 1 point each, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So whatever the best score of the 3 is, that's what goes into the system. Until you get 50 out of 50, you might as well go ahead and use up all 3 chances, because if you get worse on the 3rd one than the 2nd one, it's not going to bring that score down, but you have the chance of doing better. So it could be useful to go ahead and take all 3 attempts if you'd like to. The first time I did this as an online assignment, one student had taken it before she even came into the last class. And so I just pulled her aside real quick and I said, I saw that you took it. You got 50 out of 50 on your first attempt. Can you just give me some clue as to how you did so well right off the bat? She just said, I did exactly what you said. I went back, looked through all the questions, and so I knew what all the answers were. And when it came up, just sailed right through because I'd already seen it all before. So assuming that she wasn't just trying to say, oh yeah, teach, you say what you said is golden, I'll assume that she actually did follow the suggestion. And it is a pretty good study technique for this.
So essentially we can take the Q at any time.
Yeah, it's actually been there all semester. I don't have assignments show up at a certain time. I've just put them all in there. They don't have to worry about making sure they open up on time. They're always there. So you're welcome to go ahead and get started on it now. I'm telling you about it now. You have to have it done a month from now, basically. So you might want to take some time before you actually sit down to do it to make sure that you're prepared for it. Okay. So those are the things you have yet to do, which you have to complete. These 2 assignments here specifically say that they're due by 1:35 on the 13th. That is the final due date for everything. So anything that you haven't done, get it done by now, by then, and it'll be factored into your grade. If you're going to go back and redo part 1, 2, and 3 assignments to get better scores on it, which I would strongly suggest you do, if you've already done the assignment, like you got 9 out of 10 on the first one, and 8 out of 10 on the second one, and 17 out of 20 on the third one, and you want to go back and do them again, perfectly welcome to do that. Do them in reverse order. Do part 3, then part 2, then part 1. The reason for that is when you open up part 1 and take it again, it'll count that as a late submission, and you won't be able to get into part 2 until I check it off. So if you do it in reverse order, do part 3, the link to part 4 will disappear, but if you've already done part 4, that's fine. It doesn't erase the work you did, it just takes the link out of the system. So do part 3, get 100% on that, and then do part 2, the link to part 3 will disappear, part 4 will still be hidden. But get part 2 done to 100%, and then go back and do part 1. If you do 1, 2, and 3 in that order, then when you do 1, 2 will disappear. You could do 3 and wait until I get around to opening up part 2 for you again, but it's just easier if you do it in reverse order, if you've already done them. If you haven't done them, of course, you have to do them in the proper order, and you have to wait for me to check off on things for being submitted late. So keep that in mind. Okay. I also want to talk a little bit about what's in the book. So we're starting Unit 3, there we go, which is Regulation, Integration, and Control. And there's 6 chapters here. The first 5 are about the nervous system, and then the 6th one is about the endocrine system. Now, I actually wrote the nervous system chapters for this book. That's why I'm familiar with the book. There's a couple of things to mention about that. One, the way I wrote it is the way that I teach this material. So more than other chapters, this will be a really good place to get material from the chapters that directly correspond to the assignments you've been having, especially the part 1 and part 2. Especially the part 3 and part 4 assignments, where it might be a matter of word choice here and there. Also, this is set up sort of in the way that I like to teach and the way I think this course should be taught. I'll talk a little bit more in a second about what these mean, but the 3rd and 4th chapters here, called Somatic and Autonomic Nervous Systems, because the way that we as a department treat this 2-semester course, we basically break the material between what these 2 chapters are about. I would hope that I'm able to convince some of my colleagues to make that break a little bit more obvious, but we haven't been able to get everybody together to sit down and talk about it for a while. So I set it up so that these 2 chapters are sort of the natural break point for how we teach this, how I teach this course. I actually put this 5th chapter here, even though we're going to actually be talking about it this semester. This is a very unique chapter compared to a lot of the similar textbooks in this, available to people for teaching this kind of course. So this first chapter here, nervous system and nervous tissue, pretty standard. It's about what is nervous tissue, what are the cells, how do neurons generate electrical signals, and that sort of thing. That's what we're going to talk about. And then the next one's also fairly standard in that it's about the structure of the brain, the spinal cord, and other parts of the nervous system. And it's more about anatomy than anything else. And then the physiology of the nervous system, I've broken apart into these 2 chapters. This one is really kind of focusing on what is conscious and voluntary, what we're consciously aware of, perceiving in the environment around us, and what we're voluntarily capable of doing to respond to it. And then the other chapter here is more about how the nervous system is in charge of homeostasis. So those are a lot of unconscious perceptions, or I should say sensations, and involuntary responses to that. So that'd be things like controlling blood pressure or heart rate, or the movement of food through the digestive system and that kind of thing. And really, as far as this department's concerned, we save that material for A&P2. So I like having it sort of broken off as a separate chapter there. The other book that our department uses actually puts that material within another chapter, which I think kind of muddies the issue a little bit. So I like having it broken out there. Then, like I said, this last chapter here is a little bit unique. It's called the neurological exam, and in the material on Blackboard, I called the corresponding folder in the weekly material neurological correlates. What I've done in the past, calling that material the neurological exam, has gotten people to think that there's a test that day. But really, this is an exam in the sense of a physical examination. This is what's done in the doctor's office or some clinical setting to assess neurological function. And I include it because I think it's a very useful way to understand how the nervous system works. Looking at how it doesn't work when there's disease states going on really does give us a better idea of how it works in normal. So I'm actually going to talk about this in our last week, which will kind of complement what we're talking about the week before, which is these two chapters here. So we'll kind of see how this goes, all fits together as we're going through the next few weeks. But that's essentially how it's broken up. The sixth chapter here on the endocrine system, it's included in this unit because it's another way that our body regulates what's going on, especially in homeostasis. But it's not a chapter that I wrote. I just stuck to the nervous system stuff. Actually, the editor originally was going to make all of mine one unit, and I said, no, you got to include endocrine, because without including it here, it doesn't make sense by itself. So that's not really an issue for this semester. That's something we're going to get to next semester. So, okay. I actually want to start out this material not talking about nervous tissue itself so much, but rather about how the nervous system is set up. So actually what I'm going to do today, I'm going to sort of introduce this aspect of things. I might get around to talking a little bit about nervous tissue, and then we'll take a break. And then the second half, we're going to be talking about nervous tissue to some extent within the context of the laboratory material, which is looking at that tissue under the microscope. And I have all of the tissue saved as digital files, so we'll be looking at it on the screen there, but I'll tie it into what we're talking about in the book. Now, part of what got me interested in this project and writing these chapters was actually that I've had problems with how these chapters are handled by most textbooks. Now, usually a textbook is written by one or a couple of authors, and they aren't necessarily experts in every field. What's nice about this book is that experts in different fields wrote the different chapters. So my background is in neuroscience. That's what I got my doctorate in. So I concentrated on that. I know things about other systems, and heck, I teach this course, but this is the stuff that I'm mostly an expert in. And I've always felt that, especially this introductory chapter here, gets something quite confused in trying to explain what's going on here. Now, the first thing that we want to kind of look at is how the nervous system is broken down into different regions or different parts, different divisions. I make a very big point in this first chapter that those divisions fall into two kind of groups. There are structural divisions, or the anatomy of the system, which is what we're looking at here, and there are functional divisions. Other textbooks will often try to fit those together. And I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about when I get to the functional side of things. But anatomically, the nervous system is broken down into two basic regions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system is really just the brain and spinal cord. One way of thinking about it is that it's what's encased within the brain and the spinal column, the cranial and vertebral cavities of the body. That's actually not a great definition of it, because there are some things that extend out from the brain and spinal cord before they leave that cavity. So they're technically in the periphery, but it's a good way to think about it. It's the brain and spinal cord. When we get to talking about the tissue, we'll see that one important aspect that at the tissue level is that the central nervous system is sort of more protected from the rest of your body than the periphery is. There's a barrier between the brain and spinal cord and the blood, which is called the blood-brain barrier. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the tissue stuff. But it really does set up that the brain and spinal cord are very different in relation to the body than the other nervous tissue out there. The peripheral nervous system is really made up of a bunch of structures that mostly fall into the category of either being ganglia or nerves. Ganglia is plural for the word ganglion, and then nerve. Now in the picture here, it points out ganglion and nerve. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Everything's colored yellow. It's a little hard to tell exactly where it's pointing, but right off the edge of the spinal cord, is a little cluster of cells, which is called a ganglion. And then nerves are these fibers, groups of fibers extending out to the periphery. In this model here, we're looking at the spinal column and the nervous system in relation to it. The nervous system is all of the yellow rubber that we see. All of these little fibrous things coming off here are the nerves. If you look at the base of the nerve, where it's actually kind of going into the spinal column, there's a little thickening there. And that thickening represents where there's a little cluster of cell bodies, and that's called ganglion. So it is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord there, but everything outside of the brain and spinal cord is either a ganglion or a nerve to some extent. So that's a good way of just describing what makes up the peripheral nervous system there. Now, when we look, especially in the brain, we can see the tissue, when we haven't prepared it at all, as having either a gray or a white appearance to it. Actually, gray is a little bit of a misnomer, but white matter is really what that tissue looks like. It has a lot of lipid-rich materials in it, so it's kind of a fatty-looking tissue, so it's going to be kind of white in appearance. And a lot of that lipid-rich tissue doesn't need a very strong blood supply, so there's not a whole lot of blood vessels in it. So that's white matter. And then we'll sometimes see next to that what we call gray matter. That's not actually always perfectly gray. It's just called that in comparison to the white matter. In very fresh tissue, what we call gray matter is actually going to be kind of pink, because the blood that's in there will give it that kind of color. As the tissue ages, if it hasn't been treated, it might actually become kind of gray in appearance. Sometimes I've seen brain tissue as it ages that becomes more of a tannish yellow color. This is actually a slice of a human brain. that's been preserved in formalin. Formalin is just a particular concentration solution of formaldehyde. But this is probably about a 28-year-old sample. Not meaning that it came from a 28-year-old person, but that we acquired this about 28 years ago when we moved into this building. And so it's been sitting at least that long. And this kind of represents how it might discolor over the years. The white matter isn't that white, but it is definitely the lighter component of it. And then the gray matter, sure, maybe that's kind of a grayish color. I think it's getting a little bit of a tannish tint to it as it's getting older. But
Is it in water?
sorry?
Is it in water?
It's in formalin, which is a specific concentration of formaldehyde. So it's preserved. It just isn't stained. The picture in the book here, this is a rather fresh specimen taken out of a cadaver, which has also been fixed probably with formaldehyde, but again, not stained. So this is sort of the natural color of the tissue here. Now, this next section here introduces the idea, or doesn't introduce, comes back to the idea ganglion, which is a cluster of cell bodies in the periphery, which we just saw. A similar structure in the central nervous system is called a nucleus. And I just want to point out that there's 3 different meanings of the word nucleus that we've used in this class up to this point. There's an atomic nucleus, which is where the protons and neutrons are found within an atom. There's a cellular nucleus, which is the organelle that contains DNA in the cell. And then here, when we're saying nucleus, we're talking about a specific structure in gray matter. In this picture here, which is kind of small on the screen, there's a little red outline right here highlighting one particular nucleus. We could just as well outline this thing here, or this thing right here, or this little thing right here, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all individual nuclei, little clusters of cells. The word nucleus is used in these 3 senses for similar reasons. It basically means the center of something. So this is the center of an atom. This is the center of a cell. Maybe not the perfect geometrical center, but it's the center where everything's kind of happening. And then a nucleus within the brain or spinal cord is a center where a particular function is controlled. This being such a small picture, I can't be entirely sure, but I think the nucleus that's highlighted there is one that's often associated with reward behavior. So people that are addicted to drugs will often see unusual activity in that area. If we can record from that part of the brain when somebody's performing a simple task, that might light up when they get the task right or something like that. Okay, so it's a region of the brain that's the center for a particular function. And for that, if it's what I think it is, that'd be the reward center in the brain. Okay, so when you hear the word nucleus, or when you see it in a question, more importantly, be sure you understand the context of what we're talking about. A lot of times, whether it can happen in A&P1 or A&P2, I'll be talking to students about staining, which I talked to you about earlier when we were studying tissue, and I'd ask what's found in the nucleus of a cell, because that's what's picking up the most stain when we're staining tissue. And I'll have students that say protons and neutrons, because they're not getting the context straight. The nucleus of an atom has protons and neutrons. The nucleus of a cell has DNA. And the nucleus in the brain or spinal cord is a cluster of cells. Okay. Now, after that little spiel about nuclei, the next part in here is talking about nerves in the periphery, which we already saw, And the corresponding thing in the central nervous system is called a tract. This is a bundle of nerve fibers, or what we call axons. When we're talking about muscles, there's a nerve that was attached to the muscle, and the fiber within that is called an axon. A whole bundle of axons together is called a nerve in the periphery and a tract in the central nervous system. Sometimes it can be called two different things, even though it's the same bundle of fibers. For example, the fibers that leave the eye are called the optic nerve. Once they get into the brain, which takes place at this level right here, from that point back, they're called the optic tract. Okay, it's the same fibers, it's just what we call them in the periphery and what we call them in the central nervous system. That's not something we come across a whole lot, but it is important to understand that the name really just talks about where it's located. Optic nerve versus optic tract will contain the exact same axons. They come from the eye and they go back into the brain. This little table down here, after introducing those things, is just 4 different terms: nerve, tract, ganglion. I'm sorry, nucleus, tract, ganglion, and nerve. One is what we call a group of cell bodies, and the other is what we call a bundle of axons. One pair is what they are in the central nervous system, the other pair is what they are in the peripheral nervous system. Now, you will get actually probably a few questions based on this information. I might ask you something like, what do we call a bundle of fibers that we find in the central nervous system? So what's the answer to that? Bundle of fibers in the central nervous system.
You want to know what?
Bundle of fibers in the central nervous system. A tract, right there. Okay. When I ask that question, I will get people saying tract. I'll get a number of people saying nucleus and a number of people saying nerve, which I can only imagine is they didn't really read the whole question. I said a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. So you have to line those 2 bits up. So if they picked up on central but weren't paying attention to that I was actually asking about a bundle of axons, they might say nucleus. I can understand that. It's not right, but I can understand where they're going with that. They say nerve, maybe they heard bundle of axons and didn't get central out of that. Okay. What really surprises me is that there are people that will answer that question with ganglion, okay, which is completely the wrong thing. Okay. It's not a bundle of axons and it's not in the central nervous system. Okay. So pay attention to the question that I'm asking and you'll get the answer out of this little 4-square thing. Okay. So in probably part 1 of the nervous tissue material, you'll have that question somewhere. You may or may not get it, depending on whether it comes up in the 10 questions that are pulled out of the pool that you have, but it is in there. And so be aware that it's really just getting at this basic information. I warn my classes semester after semester about this. And every time I get people that are answering it completely incorrectly. So please pay attention to that. Yeah.
So if it is tract in the center of our peripheral, what would it be? Tract.
Tract is central. What would the same thing be in the periphery?
No, right.
Nerve. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The other way that we divide up the nervous system is functionally. There's actually a couple of ways we do that. Now, before I really get into this, I want to mention, or go back to what I mentioned earlier, that some other textbooks will try to kind of put the functional and the anatomical divisions together, which is always misleading. And the book itself will contradict itself. So I'm making a very explicit point to separate these out. So the basic functions that we associate with the nervous system, sort of like the basic functions that we associate with the skin, the basic functions that we associate with the skeleton. The nervous system largely is in charge of receiving information and responding to it. So we have our sensory functions, how we receive information from the environment around us. And we have motor functions, which is how we respond to that information. Now, calling it motor function actually is a little bit oversimplified. We think of it most basically as how we move our body in relation to the information we have coming in from the outside world. So motor in that sense does mean movement. But motor functions can involve skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. Producing sweat is a nervous system response. So when your body temperature is going up, you'll produce sweat, and that's regulated by the nervous system. So to call that a motor response seems kind of strange because the gland's not really moving. There's no muscle involved with it, but it is the response there. So if you're looking at that first paragraph under basic functions, you'll see that it talks about sensation and response, which is motor function. And then the next bold-faced word is integration. There are some parts of the nervous system that don't clearly fit into a sensory or a motor function, but rather it's where we put the information together to sort of decide what we're going to do. At its most simple form, what we're talking about here would be something like a simple withdrawal reflex. If you touch a hot stove, you're going to pull your hand away. Okay? So your fingers are touching the hot stove, they're getting the sensation. The sensory endings in your skin of your fingers sense the hot or painful stimulus. That information is sent up through a nerve to your spinal cord, and then a response comes from your spinal cord immediately to, say, your biceps brachii to contract and pull the hand away from that hot source. There's not really integration in that. It's just the information goes directly into the spinal cord, and the response comes right out of it. But if we think about more complex behavior, we can see these components to it, but also see where the integration comes in. So imagine you're driving in your car. You're getting sensations of visual stimuli, auditory stimuli. You're going to get some tactile feedback, say from your steering wheel as you're driving. You can feel sort of what the car is doing beneath you. Those sort of things. That's all the information coming in. And then your response coming out is going to be how you control the gas pedal and the brake pedal and the clutch if you drive a standard car, how you move the gear shift, how you turn the wheel, how you turn on blinkers, or all those sorts of things, those responses. It's much more complicated than just pulling your hand away from a hot stove. And the integration is really about how you put all of the information together and come up with the plan on how to respond to it. So you might hear barking off to the side, but you also see a big fence around the house that you're driving past. So you integrate together the idea that, okay, there's probably a dog over there, but he's probably not going to be come running out into the street because he's behind this fence. So you don't really have to respond to that. Okay, it's not going to affect how you drive. But then you're driving along and you see, oh, the gate's open. So then you're going to slow down a little bit, pay more attention to be sure that this barking dog doesn't run out in front of you or something like that. So the integration is really in how you're putting all those bits of information together and how your brain's deciding how to respond to what's going on. Okay. So that's the basic functions. The other functional division in the body has to do with those two chapters I was pointing out. And it has to do with how we control the body. Mainly thinking about the response side of things, the motor control. We have what we call the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is mainly about how we consciously and voluntarily respond to the world around us. There is a sensory component to everything, to these two things. And so the sensory aspect of our somatic nervous system is mostly about our conscious perceptions, what we actually perceive in the world around us. So sight, sound, taste, smell, balance, those kinds of things. All of that's coming in, and then we respond to all of that voluntarily, really just by moving skeletal muscles. The somatic nervous system is largely defined by just what we, how we move skeletal muscles. Again, thinking about how we split AMP1 and 2 at this school, we're going to concentrate on the somatic nervous system this semester. Okay? So we're really paying attention to how the nervous system integrates with the muscles that we just talked about in the last unit, skeletal muscles. The other division here is about the autonomic nervous system. And it's the response aspect of what's going on here is basically everything but skeletal muscle. It's how we control heartbeat or something like that through cardiac muscle, how we just control our digestive system, for example, through smooth muscle, or how we control glands, like sweat glands when we get hot, or glands in our digestive tract to secrete juices in our stomach or something like that to digest food. All of those things, everything that's not skeletal, is really tied into how we regulate homeostatic mechanisms in our body. Okay? When we're hot, we cool down by producing sweat. When our stomach is getting full and there are macromolecules that need to be digested, muscles in our stomach and glands in our stomachs do what they're supposed to do to help digest that food down, okay, and move it along through the rest of the system. That's the autonomic nervous system. This is really something we're going to talk about next semester. Like I said, it's really part of AMP2. The paragraph after that, in boldface, it has the enteric nervous system, which is nervous tissue in your guts. Enteric basically means guts, your digestive organs in your abdominal cavity. And there's a lot of nervous tissue in there. So the enteric nervous system is really that. That's really an extension of the autonomic nervous system in the sense that, like I just said, we control how our stomach digests food as it's going through or something like that. So the enteric nervous system is really about the nervous tissue there that's playing that role. It's getting input from the brain and spinal cord through the autonomic nervous system. Okay? And again, that's mostly going to be something we talk about in AMP2, and especially for that, what we talk about when we get to the digestive system. Okay? This picture kind of puts things together. It calls back this picture here from the beginning, but now it's trying to sort of show how in the brain there are sensory and motor components for somatic and autonomic divisions. In the nerves, there are somatic and autonomic components. In the spinal cord, there's somatic and autonomic components. And in the ganglia, there are somatic and there are autonomic ones. The enteric nervous system is really part of the autonomic response, but anatomically it's what's located in the digestive tract. So this is sort of the figure that I put in here, and the art director and editor sort of helped me put this together. I'm not terribly crazy about this figure, but other textbooks will often say there's the brain and the spinal cord that make up the central nervous system. And in the periphery, we have nerves and ganglia, and we have sensory nerves, and we have motor nerves, and we have somatic nerves and we have autonomic nerves. We have somatic ganglia and autonomic ganglia, making it sound like those functional divisions are only in the periphery. But there are parts of the brain and the spinal cord that are dedicated to just somatic or just autonomic functions. So I want to make a point there that that's in fact the case. And I go into a little bit of detail making that point in this section here. So that's the end of this section of the chapter, which was the basic structure of the nervous system. Then it goes on to look at nervous tissue in the next section, okay, which will get onto the nerve cells, what are called neurons. We'll get to that in a second. The next three sections, which is the function of nervous tissue, the action potential, and communication between neurons, that's what we're going to be dealing with next week, okay? So this week, besides just setting up so that you understand what's coming the rest of the semester, was first just understanding the divisions of the nervous system here. And then we want to talk about just nervous tissue. And in talking about nervous tissue, I'm going to include with that, in next week's folder, some of the lab material, which is under the link that says nervous tissue. And I've put it here next to the lab quiz because the questions in the lab quiz will have to do with what we cover here. But in this link, we go to a folder online where I've saved a number of micrographs. And so we're going to be looking at these things here as we're looking at the nervous tissue in this section. So I'll talk about nervous tissue and I'll kind of include the laboratory material with it through those pictures. Before we stop to take a break, I do want to kind of set this up just so that I don't put too much on the back end of today. Nervous tissue is made up of two types of cells. There are neurons, which is what we call nerve cells, and we'll talk about that after the break. And there are glial cells, or glia. Nervous tissue comes in many different, forms and fashions, if you will, but it's always made up of that. There are nerve cells and there are glial cells, neurons and glia. The glia actually outnumber the nerve cells probably about 10-to-1 overall. But the neurons are what we usually think of as the more important cells, mostly because they're responsible for a lot of the electrical communication that we focus on studying the nervous system. So what I want to do is talk about the structure of the neuron, and then we'll look at it under the microscope. And then we'll look at glia and look at some examples of those under the microscope also. Now, a picture like this is sort of the basic introduction to what a neuron is. Neurons have essentially three major parts. There's the cell body itself, which is also sometimes called the soma, which is just the Greek word for body. And then it has a number of things sticking off of it, which fall into two different categories. One category of things sticking off of it are dendrites. And those are the receiving structures on the neuron. It's getting electrical signals from other sources there. And then there's the one axon that's sticking off of the cell. So one axon and then however many dendrites are sticking off of a cell sort of define its basic structure. Sort of ghosted in to this picture, coming up here from the top corner or down here at the end, are little bits of other cells. Okay, so here's an axon that's coming in to connect to the dendrites of this cell. And then the axon from this cell then connects to dendrites of another cell through synapses. Remember, we talked about synapses a little bit in the context of the neuromuscular junction. So we're going to come back and look at those in more detail in this chapter here. Also in this picture, another cell is represented because there's little bits of insulation, a little wrapping around the axon, represented in this kind of slightly translucent blue-green structure we see here. The cell that's sort of reaching out and wrapping around the axon here is a type of glial cell. This is its specific name, and we'll talk about it when we get to it later on. But glial cells are sort of supporting cells, and one of the things that certain types of glia do is they insulate axons, so that when the electrical signal is traveling down the length of the axon, it can be speeded up a little bit because of what the that insulation does. The insulation is called a myelin, or is called myelin, and so this one's sort of segment of that here is labeled as the myelin sheath. There's 4 more myelin sheaths sort of pictured here. There's a gap between each one called a node of Ranvier. The name that's associated with that, Ranvier, is a dead white guy name, French guy actually, so it has that weird kind of pronunciation to it. But that's a formal name for that structure. I'll often just refer to them as nodes. When we know what we're talking about, those are the only nodes that we have to deal with. But there's a little gap between the myelin sheaths because of how the electrical signal works, and that needs to be there. Next week, when we're getting to talking about the electrical signal, we'll understand what those are for, but I just want to show you that they exist. And we're going to look at a micrograph today that shows you what this sort of looks like in real life. So I'll come back to that there. When we're talking about neurons, we can initially sort of classify them based on their shape. There are 3 major shapes of neurons, and they're based on how many things there are coming off of the cell body. So when one thing is sticking off of the cell body, we call that a unipolar neuron. When 2 things are, we call that a bipolar neuron. And then when more than 2 things are sticking off of it, we call it a multipolar neuron. Now we could call cells tripolar, quadrupolar, or something like that, but all of those different sorts of things, more than 2 pieces sticking off of the cell, they all kind of fit together into a bigger group. So we just call those multipolar neurons. Now these are drawn very much to kind of look cartoonish because there's some variation of what the cells really look like from instance to instance. So this is just to give you an idea of the basic layout of them. The next picture in the book here kind of shows a few actual examples of cells. These would be cells that we would look at under the microscope, and somebody has sort of traced a picture of what it looks like, so we can see that here. We could do a similar thing just doing a search for oops, sorry. One of these types of cells. We can see images of these types of cells. The black and white ones are kind of like the drawings I'm showing you. The ones with color are actual micrographs that have been stained. So we can see a little variation in their shapes here. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those when we're looking at the micrographs there. So the next section is getting into the glial cells. And I want to save talking about the glial cells until after we finish talking about neurons. Okay. But I don't want to get started on talking about the neurons in a whole lot of detail right now. I want to save that for after the break when we can look at these under the microscope and spend some time with them. So we'll go ahead and take the break now. It's what, 2:40-ish? Call it 2:42. So be back in here 3:05, somewhere in there, and we'll get back to this and finish talking about this material. Okay. Sorry.